So good morning. Thank you for letting me share some of my story. My name is Lynne Brumbaugh, and I was asked to share a little bit about how I feel connected to Nigeria, and specifically the EYN, the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria. So I will be using some letters here and there. So if I say CBM, I mean Church of the Brethren Mission, which is what the church in Nigeria was originally called. And then when it became truly the Nigerian church, where Church of the Brethren, COB, became partners and sisters and brothers rather than leaders or in charge of the Nigerian church, became EYN. And the other term I'm going to use later is ZME, which is the Women's Fellowship in Nigeria. So just that will be some of what I'm talking about today. So I just want to say that I have felt connected to the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria my entire life in multiple ways. I will point to a few, and not in chronological order. So I first knew about Nigeria because I grew up in a congregation with two families that were serving long-term on the mission field. They were the Ogburns and the Bolins, if any of you have met them. Back then, travel was sometimes by boat to go across the ocean, and families would only come back to the U.S. every couple years, and then they would stay for a furlough year. So I got to know them well when they were back home, and the children were my age and in Sunday school classes. In learning about their stories, I just want to say to all of you, please know that children in our congregation become part of the connections that we build with our sisters and brothers when they hear the stories of how we are involved with local and global mission. They're an important time of faith formation when even they're listening from the periphery or seeing visuals from our different presentations now and again. I mentioned the children and connections, and so want to mention that I had a sabbatical time in Nigeria, and my young sons, who were in elementary school, were with me for several months. It was during the year-long 75th anniversary of the beginnings of CBM, EYN, and thousands of these t-shirts, which I just happened to be wearing today, did not plan to wear, but this is a picture of what was supposed to be a tamarind tree in Garkita, which was where the first worship service of the missionaries was held under a tree in Garkita. And so this is considered the birthplace, and this was their Diamond Jubilee celebration. Thousands of these t-shirts were worn by Nigerians during that year. And my children had the privilege of carrying handmade cards from children in the Church of Brethren congregations, specifically to celebrate the anniversary. And they delivered them as we went around to maybe even 100 different congregations or fellowships in Nigeria, and delivered them directly to the children in Nigeria. So again, probably some cards made at Bridgewater were in the hands and were delivered very personally to the children in Nigeria from other children. So that's something that matters to me a great deal, is knowing that it's through the lifespan that we connect. The next thing I will mention is that I had several years working in the Church of the Brethren offices in Elgin, and I got to know many U.S. folk who were going back and forth to programs and visitations, long-term work in Nigeria. And I also had the joy of getting to know many EYN members as they would come through and would visit for a time, either for preparation to go to Bethany Seminary or to participate in meetings with leaders in the Church of the Brethren in the U.S. As they had partnership meetings. And during many of those interactions, I was heavily influenced as I was introduced to the rural health program in Nigeria and what was happening there. So the program was started by the mission folk early on, but again was carried on as the Nigerian church became truly Nigerian. The rural health program was fascinating and phenomenal. And it included things like storytelling and local community workers who would go into homes And so they weren't rooted in the clinic, they were rooted in the community, looking at ways to improve health and well-being that weren't just curative, but were public health and prevention ways. But eventually expanded and included things like literacy, especially maternal literacy. I frequently share that most people don't know that if you want to reduce infant mortality, you teach women to read. And that's a higher relationship than medicines and prenatal care and all of that globally. So that was part of what the church was involved in with the Rural Health Program, was looking at a whole life perspective. That program became so important and included community development methods like that it became recognized by the World Health Organization and was used as one of many models to create something they called primary health care. And the only reason I bring that up is that my entire career was influenced so much by this that's what I studied. That's what I taught. That's what I did my research on. That's the kinds of policy work that I became involved in, were all of these values and principles that were rooted in the Nigerian Rural Health Program. And so trying to bring together how my interactions through the church then influenced my interactions beyond the church. One time I was hosting some of the EYN leaders, and several of the women who were part of the Women's Fellowship, ZME, were sitting at breakfast with me. It was just 3 of us, and in just casual conversation, they asked about my life beyond the church. And so I said I was in graduate school and preparing to do my research related to primary health care. And they said, "You should come to Nigeria. You should come and be with us in the Women's Fellowship, because we include primary health care activities in what we do, and we could be where you focus your research." So they changed my life. and they changed it in many ways, because they then became partners in the research and really guided me once I was on the ground, helped me identify communities to go visit, women to interview, participated in helping me do analysis so that I could understand some of the cultural meanings behind what they said. One of the things I've learned in my lifetime is just because we use the same words does not mean we are actually saying the same thing. And they were very helpful in helping me understand what the Nigerian context and meaning was, that even though I had lots and lots of years of interaction, I hadn't lived in Nigeria until I spent that period of time doing my research, and then later was when I did my sabbatical and was there for a longer period of time. But most of my interactions have been from the U.S. In relationships, which is what you are part of as well. As you sit in the pews here and go to meetings, you're part of those long-term relationships, and other people are your hands and feet as they go back and forth. So what I wanted to share a little bit, depending how much time I have, was some of the things that they taught me that I learned a lot from a professional perspective, but it kept coming back to, they were very clear that while they were doing primary health care that is beyond church, because they were reaching out to communities and beyond their own group and beyond Christians. Some of what they did was reaching out to their Muslim neighbors. They did a lot beyond. But they also were very clear that they were Christian. So you will see in the themes that I learned from them, that came out of the research, that their Christian faith is very much rooted in it. So this was sort of the title of my research when it was done, was Nigerian Women Working Together, Bringing Life to Primary Health Care. And that basically meant that they brought their whole life, they brought their group life, they brought their family life into what they were doing with primary health care. So working together, being hand in hand. They didn't believe in doing anything as individuals. They believed in fellowship, they believed in being accountable and engaged in each other's lives in very, very active ways. And so one of the things they learned was how to do things by doing it together. So they did things for the group, but then it benefited what they would do in their own lives and with their own families. And I loved this picture because more modern Nigerian women were getting formal education, and for a while took on this social attitude of we're better than these people that are still in their traditional ways. And what ZME did was they recognized that they needed to honor their elders, and they actually needed to learn the traditional ways that, because they were modern women, hadn't been taught to them because they were in formal school. And so this is simply a picture of learning how to spin thread directly from cotton, using a weight to help stretch it out. And so our lovely modern woman, who normally wouldn't humble herself to learn at the feet of one of the elders, this is a picture of how they learned to do things by doing them together. They shared life. Some things like weddings and births and deaths were huge events and could be life-changing events for families because everyone would gather, but the family was the one responsible for hosting them and feeding them, and it could bankrupt a family. And what they got from the fellowship was that the fellowship took all that responsibility on alongside them with the family. And part of what they learned to do to raise money for the women's fellowship, but pastors would say that they were the backbones of the congregations and fellowships because they're the ones that raised money for most of the church work. Money was not easy to come by in terms of just putting money in an offering plate. So there had to be some pretty significant things to build all of the lovely church buildings and congregations and activities and outreach that they did. So they literally would hire themselves out as a group to go do hard physical labor. And once again, many of these women were formally educated, high-powered government jobs, and to go back and work in the fields and sweat and toil and develop blisters was no small thing. And they came to love it. Absolutely loved being together. And they would talk about how they were the first one on the van to go out because that time together with singing and rejoicing just nurtured their spirits and helped them feel like they were part of something that was really important. Many of the women were very rural and hadn't been out and about much until they became part of ZME, and then they would go do visitations. So discovering who I am by discovering a bigger world was only an opportunity that they had by being part of the Women's Fellowship. Otherwise, they would have been very isolated. Because many of the women that I did interact with really were still in rural areas and were still not literate. They were learning, but they still were moving along. And so I just kind of wanted to share that as they grew in leadership, as the longer they were in, the more the next generation or the next people coming up looked to them as wise women, and they just felt so good about themselves because they learned things that they then could share and felt responsible to share with others. So this was the travel part. But I loved this picture because women in Nigeria, especially when they were in men's circles, were not supposed to speak. And being part of ZME, and I'm not sure how well you can see this picture, but this woman is just standing up and so exhibits this thing of expressing freely where I stand. They were no longer going to be silenced, and they spoke their piece and really encouraged others to come along and become more empowered. And to me, that was just a very phenomenal thing. And then the last area was this issue of staying with. This was a term they used over and over again. And I initially thought that meant physically staying with their family, staying with their community. But what I learned was it's about relationship. Staying with is how they stay with, how they're in relationship. And so dwelling together in peace is a big deal, and is even a bigger deal now that Boko Haram is so present. But relationships within families, even within the church, sometimes included violence. And so this notion of growing into partnership through being a virtuous woman was not asking women to be virtuous and humble, but it was saying they're going to focus on what they have to offer and what they can bring, and their husbands learn to value them as partners because of what they learned within the women's fellowship that they could then bring as an empowered woman in a way that wasn't belittling or demeaning or trying to well, they were loving rather than judgmental of their spouses is kind of what they learned. So that was important. But this one here, I thought was huge, because this was really about how they interacted with their Muslim neighbors. And often they simply would get some sugar or get something and go visit and say, hey, I've got a little bit of something and I will share it with you. Because Muslim women would often cross the street rather than even be physically near a Christian. And most of EYN is in predominantly Muslim parts of Nigeria. The southern part of Nigeria is very Christian, but the northern part is predominantly Muslim. And so being a Christian in that area has been difficult the entire time. But this was a way of the women's fellowship in EYN, of course, saying, we are neighbors, and we need to actually recognize and be part of each other and be loving and kind. So I'm sharing that because this is how we are connected. They learned a lot of that from Sunday school, from the sermons they received, in the same ways that we do. And they are living them out in ways that, to me, highlight how we continue to be sisters and brothers in our faith, and how we are brethren. Not that there's anything wrong with being any other denomination or faith group, but there's something special about us being here as part of the Church of the Brethren family in Bridgewater. There's something very special about them being part of their congregations and fellowships in Nigeria, EYN. And our roots are the same, and the ways that we try to live them out may look a little different, but they're grounded in the same understanding of loving and caring and being connected to one another as a family. So that's part of what I wanted to share about how I was asked to really talk about was what are my prayers? And I wrote it down, and I may cry. These last many years of Boko Haram have been very difficult. I personally knew many of those, and still know many of the families whose children were taken. I've been in Chibok numerous times, stayed in Chibok for several weeks at different points. And so a lot of that's very personal to me. Some of you may have met through the years Sarah and Musa Mumbala. I know they've visited here in Bridgewater several times. And they are now living in the United States because they are on death lists, assassination lists from Boko Haram, and so they had to come and seek asylum in the United States. And he's been serving in pastorates, and for a while was at Bethany Seminary as an international scholar in residence. He is doctorally prepared and was, again, intending to be retired after an incredible career as a dean, both in the University of Maiduguri, which is a major state government school, but also at one point he was one of the major leaders, faculty at the Theological College of Northern Nigeria, TCNN, where many of our Church of the Brethren members have actually served as faculty. Dave Metzler, a long time ago, served there for many years. And anyway, they lived, when I'm in Indiana, they lived 2 houses away from me for more than a year. And they would call me almost every day and either ask if they could come over or if I could go to them, because their family members had called them. With cell phones now, there's communication pretty frequently, and they would call to say, we've run to the bush today, or so this family member has been killed, and the pictures that were shared were slaughter. And so my prayer is that EYN and ZME and their communities can live in peace and unafraid, that they can hold on to their hope and love for one another, and that they will find ways to continue to live in their faith when there's so many challenges that could turn them away. But they keep turning towards joy. And that's my prayer for them, and that's my prayer for us, is that we will find ways to keep turning towards joy.